what can be done by the U.S. in order to regain its leadership in the Americas?
Well, I hope nothing can be done. That's up to, in large part, American citizens. Are they going to tolerate these monstrous crimes? They can't. Are they even going to know about them? So, for example, everything I've said here, you can find out for yourself, is perfectly well documented in publicly available material, but almost nobody knows about it. If you do a poll on the Harvard faculty, let's say, educated people, I suspect very few would know anything about this, except maybe a few specialists. And remember, it holds not just in Latin America, but everywhere. Same in Southeast Asia, same in the Middle East, same in every place where the world dominant power functions, which is why the United States is regarded in the world as the greatest threat to world peace, far in the lead of any other country. These, incidentally, are Gallup polls, polls taken by the leading U.S. polling agencies. The only country that's way behind in second place is Pakistan, and that's probably inflated by the Indian vote. Essentially, nobody's competing. When you hear the rhetoric in the United States, presidential candidates, newspapers, editorials, Iran is the greatest threat to world peace. But that's U.S. doctrine. The world doesn't agree. And as I said, we're protected from that information by the press, and similarly here. So, to repeat, I would hope that the U.S. won't be able to recover, just as I would hope that Russia would not be able to recover its control over Eastern Europe. It's much smaller domains. What has changed is pretty remarkable. For 500 years, Latin America has been pretty much in the hands of foreign powers and a small, local, wealthy elites. The typical Latin American state had a small, very rich, Europeanized, often white elite ruling over a mass of enormous poverty in potentially very rich societies. The elites were foreign-oriented. The capital went abroad. Imports were luxury goods, radically different from East Asia, incidentally. The countries were separated from one another. They didn't even have communications. And they were dominated by foreigners in the last century or so. That means the United States. U.S. intervention in Colombia goes back to Theodore Roosevelt tearing out Panama, and goes on. And that's changed. In the last 10 or 15 years, there was a strong reaction to the neoliberal programs, which had devastated Latin America. I mean, Latin America was the most obedient student of the so-called Washington consensus, and so it suffered most. Others suffered too, but Latin America was pretty awful. And there was a reaction to it. And it's a pretty remarkable fact. I mean, a change of something that's been going on for 500 years is not a small moment in history. The Latin American countries are taking small steps, some steps, towards integration. There are organizations that bring them together, UNASUR, Mercosur, ALBA, and so on. The beginning to deal, and integration is a prerequisite for independence, means you can't get picked off one by one. There's mutual support. The U.S. has been, the U.S. war against Cuba has been going on for 50 years. A very serious war, it's not discussed here, but major terrorist war launched by the Kennedy administration, crushing embargo. Latin America, finally, in the last 15 years, Latin America has strongly risen up in opposition to it. This showed up at the preceding summit, the Cartagena summit in Colombia, 2012, where the U.S. and Canada were completely isolated from the entire hemisphere on two issues, Cuba, and drugs. That's unprecedented. Nothing like that has ever happened. I mean, it's so extreme that Obama was finally compelled to take some small gestures towards renormalizing relations with Cuba. Here it's presented as a noble gesture. You know, we're helping Cuba escape from its isolation and so on. Actually, it's a small gesture helping the United States escape from its isolation and leaving most of the system still in place. But all of this is enormously important. There have also been efforts to deal with some of the internal problems. They're halting efforts, you know, a lot of problems with them, a lot of flaws, but something is being done. And that's basically new, not totally new, but substantially new. And I think that's extremely important. Will the U.S. be able to recover? I doubt it. I mean, in general, power in the world is being somewhat diversified. There's a lot of talk about American decline, which is pretty misleading. The United States is still incomparably the most powerful and rich country in the world. But there is a decline, and actually the decline goes back to the 1940s. It's been pretty steady. But in the last years, it's noticeable. And China's one pole, the BRICS are another potential power group. And I doubt that the post-war system of unilateral domination of the world can be reconstructed. Look, the United States, for example, has lost all its military bases in South America. Colombia was supposed to be the last hope, 6 military bases, but to everyone's surprise, at least my surprise, the Constitutional Court banned them. So right now there are none. There was a nice comment, which you probably saw, by Rafael Correa, the Ecuadorian leader, who was, when the United States, he kicked the United States out of its last base, the Manta base in Ecuador. And what he said is to the United States, you can keep the base in Manta if we can have a military base near Miami. That's about right. Actually, Evo Morales said something pretty similar. He said, you can keep fumigating in Bolivia if we can fumigate in North Carolina and Kentucky, where there's a much more lethal crop grown, incomparably more lethal tobacco that murders tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people around the world, but it's protected. So Morales said, well, let us destroy that, and you can destroy coca in Bolivia. You know. But this kind of reaction to the United States is completely new to all the imperial powers.
In 2002, director Andrew Davis launched the movie Collateral Damage, starring by Arnold Schwarzenegger and John Leguizamo. In this movie, Hollywood generalized among the American people and to the entire world a clear support to paramilitary armies by some sectors of the U.S. government. Last year, scholars Dube and Naidu wrote a working paper issued by the National Bureau of Economic Research, and in this piece they stated that, I'm quoting, U.S. military assistance leads to differential increase in attacks by paramilitaries, but has no effect on guerrillas attacks. Aid also results in more paramilitary, but not guerrilla, homicides during election years, particularly in politically competitive municipalities. The findings suggest that foreign military assistance may strengthen armed non-state actors, undermining domestic political institutions, end of the quote. In the Americas Summit, Barack Obama highlighted his commitment with the Colombian peace process. There are some roles in the peace process today, such as victims, victimizers, and facilitators, among others. Which do you think should be the role of the U.S. government in the peace process in order to help Colombia to gain a lasting peace?
I suspect the biggest help the United States can provide is to withdraw from involvement in Colombian affairs, which have been mostly quite harmful. I discussed some of it, but it's pretty general. The United States, we really shouldn't be, this is the kind of question that's asked in U.S. policy circles and academic circles all the time. What can the U.S. do to help? Okay, there is something called the Hippocratic Oath, which says, first, do no harm. When you've stopped doing harm, then you can ask the question, what can we do to help? And there's a long way to go before we get to that. These results that you mentioned are on the front page every day. So take a look at this morning's newspapers. New York Times, lead story in the New York Times this morning. It's very interesting what it tells us about the culture in which we live, Americans, that is, Harvard, high culture. It's a discussion of the fact that the drone attacks inadvertently killed an American hostage and an Italian hostage. And that's a big issue, because we're not supposed to kill Americans and Italians. So there's a huge discussion about it. And what about killing the people who live there? There's no question at all about that. The drone campaign is the most extraordinary global terrorist campaign that has ever been envisioned. I mean, suppose that Iran had a campaign in which they were assassinating people all over the world who they suspected might want to harm Iran. So, for example, they could start with the editors of the New York Times and the Washington Post, who have just run articles, no need to suspect. They've run lead op-eds calling for the immediate bombing of Iran. So we know they're planning to harm Iran, so let's kill them. Suppose they were doing that all over the place. What would we think? Well, we wouldn't have to bother thinking because it'd be a nuclear war. But when the U.S. does it, it's fine. No criticism. The drone campaign officially, not my words, is attacking suspects, people suspected of maybe wanting to harm the United States someday. Obama's meetings, whatever they are, Tuesday morning meetings, decide who we're going to kill today, who is on our kill list, a suspect who we think might want to harm us. And this goes on without virtually no comment. The only comment is about killing an American, that's a problem, or what's called collateral damage. When you attack a village with a drone and you kill somebody and half a dozen other people standing around, they get killed too. That's collateral damage, and that's considered a kind of a problem. So there are studies of how much collateral damage there is, and that's not so good. But what about killing the suspects? I mean, this happens to be the 800th year of commemoration of Magna Carta. Its great contribution was was limited, but it established the principle of presumption of innocence, that a person cannot be harmed unless tried by had due process in a trial by peers. Now, this comes up in the discussions. In this morning's Times, for example, there's a claim by the U.S. government that the suspects have due process because they are considered in the executive branch of the United States government. The United States government considers whether they're proper targets for assassination. So that's due process. That's the position of the U.S. government, the liberal government, the liberal Justice Department. And there is no comment about this. I mean, try to find it. It's just considered fine. If we want to kill anyone we suspect of maybe someday harming us, why shouldn't we? And this is considered really great because it doesn't put Americans at risk, just kills other people. So what could be better? Now, there is the problem of that you mentioned. It creates terrorists. It's a terrorist generating system. And that's very well known in high places, all kind of commentary about it. And the reasons are pretty obvious. You bomb a village in Yemen, you murder some guy who may or may not be the guy you were trying to kill, you kill a bunch of other people across the street. It inspires a desire for revenge. In fact, that's one of the reasons why the United States is the most feared country in the world, things like this. And we Americans are responsible for it. We accept it, we tolerate it. It's right in the peak of the intellectual culture. Harvard University, no protests about it, accepted. And it does have these negative effects of generating more terrorists. In fact, if you look at the terror, so-called war on terror in the last 15 years, it began in a small tribal area in Pakistan on the Afghan border. It's now all over the world. What we call terrorism has spread all over the world. It's a wonderful success. You know, we've managed to magnify what we call terrorism, meaning what they do, not what we do, all over the world. West Africa, South Asia, Middle East, of course, everywhere. And the inability to perceive this is mind-boggling. So just let me give you one last example that is endless. The day after the Iran draft agreement was accepted, of course there was a ton of coverage the next day. Read the New York Times, most important paper in the world. There's a front page story by a think piece by Peter Baker, one of their main analysts, and he discusses the agreement, the basically positives as a good step, but he says there are problems. We have to be wary about Iran. You can't trust Iran because Iran is carrying out aggression and supporting terrorism and destabilizing the region and so on. And he gives a couple of examples. The most interesting one is that Iran is supporting groups in Iraq which kill American soldiers. That's a real crime. Like when we invade a country, destroy it, kill maybe 1 million people, generate a couple million refugees, tear the country to shreds, inspire a sectarian conflict which didn't exist before and is now tearing not only the country but the region apart. That's stabilization. If somebody tries to resist our attack, that's destabilization. See if you can find a comment on that. I mean, as long as the culture is at this level of depravity, the world is in real danger. And that's the problem here, not in Colombia.
The last thing that I would like you to comment is this. Before the free trade agreement, Colombia had a positive balance of trade with the US for more than a decade. Just after this free trade agreement, the balance of trade began to decay. Today, Colombia has a commercial deficit with the US of more than $3.3 billion. In the field, one of the examples of this process is the destruction of more than 2 million tons of rice seeds by the Colombian government since 2013. Colombia government destroyed these farmers' seeds to comply the new regulation of the Free Trade Agreement and the WTO regarding property rights. As a consequence, thousands of families have to stop doing what they have done all their lives, what their ancestors have taught them by generations. In practice, these farmers won't have any chance to compete with the US rice exports. Today, they will have to starve to death or to rely on the incomes given by cocaine plantations or get into illegal armed organizations.
Exactly. And again, it's happening. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no.
It's happening all over the world. It happens everywhere. And some of the cases are...
I wanted to...
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, the question is there any convergence or coherence between the U.S. compromise with Colombian peace and its free market impositions?
I doubt it. I think the U.S. is interested in the Colombian peace agreement for pretty much the same reason that the U.S. finally abandoned its support for apartheid. The U.S. was the last country in the world to support apartheid. Reagan, who was an extreme racist, didn't even believe that apartheid existed. He said there's just tribal wars, you know, Zulu, Bantu, whites, and so on. Not a single country was supporting apartheid by around the late 80s, except for the United States. But the United States finally did back down and was willing to accept the end of apartheid. There are a number of reasons for that. Could go into it. But one reason was that there was a compromise on the table which was acceptable to U.S. business, to U.S. multinationals, and also to the white, rich, the business community in South Africa. The compromise was, we'll leave the socioeconomic system unchanged, but we'll allow some black faces in the limousines. That's basically the compromise. And the U.S. was willing to accept that, so it finally abandoned support for apartheid. Actually, there's a much more fundamental reason, which you're not allowed to talk about in the United States. It's called Cuba. Cuba had sent military forces which drove the South African army out of Angola, forced them to abandon illegally held Namibia, and made it very clear to them that they were not going to succeed in establishing this regional support system that they hoped would protect apartheid. And these were black soldiers, and it had a huge impact in Africa, both sides, you know, black Africa and white Africa. No more myth of the invincible white Superman, you know. And South Africa pretty quickly capitulated after that. We're not supposed to talk about that here, but it's amazing. They know, Africans know about it. So Mandela, as soon as he got out of jail, practically the first thing he did was to thank Castro for his enormous assistance in liberating Africa, South Africa in particular. But I think that's the kind of reason why the U.S. would tolerate the agreement now. What it wants is for the socioeconomic system in Colombia to remain, but without massacring union activists and human rights workers, which doesn't look nice. And killing, of course, the worst victims are peasants, Afro-Colombians, and indigenous, and so on. So I think they'd accept it. But this question about the rice, again, it's what you describe is correct, but remember that the rice exports from the United States are government subsidized. That has nothing to do with free markets, nothing. These are massive corporations which gain from state subsidy. And of course they're going to drive out rice farmers anywhere. It's like the corn farmers in Mexico that I mentioned. And sometimes it's kind of so grotesque you can hardly even talk about it. Like take the poorest country in the hemisphere, Haiti. Haiti was self-sufficient in rice. Now it has practically no rice production. What happened? There was an election in Haiti which went the wrong way. The Haitians chose somebody the United States didn't like, Aristide. So a couple of months later, there was a military coup which overthrew the government, installed an awful terrorist regime, actually. Visited during the terror. It was unbelievable. It was supported by the United States. They claimed to oppose it, but actually trade with the military junta increased under Clinton. And finally, Clinton allowed the Marines to enter Haiti to throw out the military junta. That's called a humanitarian intervention in the United States. What it actually was reinstatement of the traditional order. And part of it was imposition on Haiti of an extreme form of structural adjustment, extreme neoliberalism. Haiti was not permitted to impose any tariffs on imports, which means that the Arkansas rice corporations can flood, subsidized of course, can flood the Haitian market. no more rice production in Haiti. It got to such an extent that there were some small businesses surviving in Haiti. One of them was manufacturing chicken parts for sale. Well, it turns out Americans don't like dark meat, so there's a surplus of dark meat. So what do? You try to dump it on someone else. They tried to dump it on Canada and Mexico, but those are functioning governments. They used anti-dumping restrictions and they blocked it. Haiti's not allowed to do that, thanks to the free trade agreements. They have to observe the free market, not like us. So the market was flooded by exports from Tyson, the other big meat producers, the end of that industry. This kind of thing goes on all the time. I said it's a staple of economic history. It goes back to England and India, England and China. That's how modern economic history developed. The rich don't accept market discipline. Why should they? They impose it on the poor. That's called free markets. But take a look at the way it actually works.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for coming. I'm one of the organizers, and we wanted the conference to be a very sort of heuristic and instructive thing for a lot of students and young scholars in Harvard, MIT, and the surrounding area to start thinking about our responsibilities and roles towards Colombia. So as a scholar and activist, I wanted to hear your comments on what you think we as scholars, students, potential activists, what can we do to sort of remain critical towards Colombia, towards the US, and to be constructive in both our scholarship and all the work that we do?
Well, my own feeling is that the most important task is to overcome the cultural backwardness of the United States. And I mean that quite seriously. People here, you can't really accuse them of immorality. They don't know. If you go through a good educational system in the United States, you don't know any of this. Where are you going to find out? If you read the newspapers, you don't find it. If you look at scholarship, the scholars know. So, for example, John Coatsworth, one of the leading scholars, points out in a not obscure place, the Cambridge University History of the Cold War, major scholarly study. His chapter happens to be on Latin America. He points out that since 1960, that's the period I've been talking about, repression, violence, atrocities, torture in the U.S. domains of Latin America far exceed anything that happened in Eastern Europe. That's not people's picture. The picture they have is the opposite. We talk about dissidents. The very term dissident refers to East Europeans, and not to the 6 Jesuit intellectuals who were murdered by U.S.-run backed security forces in El Salvador in 1989. They're not dissidents. Dissidents are people who oppose governments we don't like, and that's the general picture. That's American intellectual and moral culture, and that needs to be cured. And the people who can cure it best are the people who know something, who have the resources, the privilege, the access to try to raise the educational and moral level, cultural and moral level.
All right. Let's take 2 questions from the audience, one from Twitter, and then we're finished.
Hi, I'm Rory Gerberg from the Harvard Kennedy School, and mine is a small addition to that question in kind of a practical sense. At meetings, a lot of the discussion about the policy failures comes from these decisions that are made, and many of us will be making some level of those decisions. What are the questions that we should be asking ourselves when we're sitting in those meetings?
Well, in my view, they're the kinds of questions I've been talking about. You might ask yourself the question, why is the United States considered the great, by a large margin, the greatest threat to world peace? What is a free trade agreement? What are the consequences of free trade agreements? Why does the free trade agreement, so-called with Mexico, lead to a flood of undocumented immigrants from corn-producing regions? which didn't happen before. You might ask why in 1994, when NAFTA was passed, why did Clinton also begin militarizing the border? It was a coincidence, maybe. Why has U.S. aid, like Lars Schultz pointed out, and many others, why has U.S. aid consistently correlated with torture, massacre, undermining democracy, and so on? Those are all questions we could ask. What is it about our society that is having these consequences? What is it about our moral culture that can allow us to read that Iran is destabilizing Iraq by supporting people who are killing American soldiers who invaded and destroyed the country? What is it about our moral and intellectual culture that allows us to read that and not to notice that something's wrong? And so on across the board. These are all questions that I think are, they're not profound questions. This is not quantum physics. It's all on the surface. We just don't think about it.
All right, we have a question over there.
Okay. I assume technology doesn't work. Go ahead.
Bueno, continúo.
Okay.
Más que mi nombre es Amanda, soy antropóloga.
My name is Amanda.
Colombia.
I am an anthropologist and activist in Colombia, and also I do conferences within the space. I'll be a panelist also as well here in the United States in Boston. My question is from the social movement, and this is in a possible scenario post-conflict. We are looking that the concentration of violence with the state and paramilitary group will be moved by the social movement, considering the politics and the ASFAR, and also a possible meeting with the LLN. What it implies that in Colombia it exists the law of liberty and democracy. In this law, there's a criminalization of social protest, and also it has to do with a lot of topics of free trade, especially with the United States. It implies a very deep topic of the activists in Colombia, and we can see everything with the legal and illegal mining, and also all the mining problems with the paramilitary groups. I'm talking about with territories in the North Cauca and also in the Pacific Coast, Quimbiquia, and we have the context of the urban work that has gone in depth in Buenaventura, which is the principal, the main port, where 60% of the exports in the country come into this port. And also this war takes place in a population of African Colombian descent. In this perspective, I believe that it's important to as an activist, entonces, to bring this up, and even though that we're talking about Havana and the dialogue past, I want to see if there's an economic model, and it's also an alliance with weapons, and also getting a lot of unions with the rich people in the country. Also to say that from the Cauca, that I'm from the Cauca, from the Pacific, at this moment there's been an increase of violence and conflict, and we have territories in the north of Cauca that even though there's a ceasefire and between the armed forces and the FARC, they assassinated 11 militaries, and one of the responses from the country, it could be, let's look at a military view. In this perspective, we continue the need for this conflict because we're the community, the poorest community in this war. So I want to say that you are an international voice to continue telling people about the violation of human rights and the activists in Colombia. And even though we are in dialogue with the FARC, that a repression continues in Colombia, and also defenders of the human rights are being assassinated.
Not surprisingly, I couldn't agree more, but it's not really my responsibility. That's everybody's responsibility. This has to be a large-scale effort. Colombians within Colombia, people here because of our crucial role and extraordinary power. So yeah, I think everything you said is correct.
All right. We'll take one last question here, and then we'll move on.
5 more minutes.
Well, thanks very much, Professor Chomsky. My name is Milun Kothari. I'm a visiting scholar at the MIT Program on Human Rights and Justice, and I was a special rapporteur at the UN for a number of years. And I just wanted to ask you if, I mean, I know it's not the topic for this afternoon, but if we can put aside the United States for a second and look at the history of how the Colombian government, the successive governments, on their own have deceived their population in the sense that, you know, they've played a very sophisticated game of pretending that it's a democracy, we don't have an armed conflict. The question I have for you is, what role do you feel the United Nations, for example, can play? Because, you know, this is a two-way thing. The Colombian government also has human rights obligations. They're participating in the Universal Periodic Review. There's huge economic, social, and cultural rights issues. So how can the international community, which is a whole lot of people aside from the United States, can also contribute in that kind of a nation-building process that goes beyond peace? Because, you know, there's a whole post-conflict industry and there's a whole thing of peace, but we have to do much more work after that, right? And there's so many Colombians who are not in a conflict situation right now. So what needs to be done, you think, from the UN where it can be effective, and which includes the people from Colombia? Thanks.
Well, I mean, you're right about the nature of Colombia. Father Javier's book, Genocidal Democracy, captures it quite accurately. The UN has had projects, as you know, in Colombia, and some of them have been pretty constructive, I think. Drug projects, peace projects, others. But the UN is not an independent actor. The UN can act just insofar as the major powers allow, and that means primarily the United States. The UN cannot, so for example, the UN Security Council in 1986 considered resolutions calling on every state to observe international law. The US vetoed them. That ends that. I mean, the resolutions didn't mention anyone in particular, but everyone knew who they were referring to. The U.S. had just rejected the International Court of Justice orders to stop its attack on Nicaragua. But the U.S. says, no, I'm sorry, we vetoed the resolution, that's the end of it. Britain and France cooperated by abstaining. But the UN can do many things and has had often a positive role of the kind that, but it's going to have to be, it will require that the United States not inhibit what it does, maybe even possibly support it, but at least not inhibit it. But yeah, I think could have a positive role, and it has elsewhere, like truth commissions, things like that.
I meant the UN Human Rights Council, because you know, the United Nations Human Rights Council with the Universal Review, and the fact that, you know, if you have a talented and educated local population that can relate to that, there have been changes in a number of countries, and you know, maybe that could be a way of...
It is a possibility. I mean, all of these institutions like the Human Rights Council are compromised by the participation. Now, a lot of the participants are leading human rights violators, so it's all kind of compromised, but nevertheless, some things can be done.
All right, with a lot of things to think about, I want everyone to join me in thanking Professor Chomsky for coming to this conference.